This is Unit 3. It's on the brain and cranial nerves. Well, the central nervous system is, in fact, made up of the brain and the spinal cord. We'll talk about the spinal cord in a later recording. But right now we'll talk about the brain, and then we'll talk about the cranial nerves that emerge from that. So the brain itself is made up of four major parts to the brain. I think I'll change color. Four major parts to the brain, and the spinal cord, those two together make up the central nervous system. The four parts of the brain are, major parts of the brain are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brain stem. Now, I just wanted to remind you that the brain is made up of a number of different cell types, but the major cell in the central nervous system is, of course, the neuron. So the major cells, the most important cells that carry the actual major function, carry out the actual major function, are neurons. Now, these neurons have, of course, in their cell body, have a nucleus, and the cell body of the neuron is surrounding that area, and each neuron has a single projection from it which carries signals away, and that projection is called an axon, and it can be very, very long, much longer than is shown here, but I'm limited by the space I have on the slide. The axon carries outgoing impulses any outgoing impulses that the neuron sends out. There are also other types of projections from that cell body, which are called dendrites, and these are finer structures that project outwards here. And these are involved in collecting or receiving incoming signals into the neuron. So you have this major cell body here, the main part of the neuron, with a nucleus in it, and projecting away from that cell body are the axon and the dendrites, the finer dendrites in that single axon. Well, within the cerebrum, and actually also the cerebellum, areas that are rich in cell bodies are called gray matter. They're darker. And areas that are rich in axons are called white matter. So you have both gray matter in the brain and you have white matter. And the white matter is mainly made of axons, and the gray matter is mainly made up of cell bodies with the nuclei, with the nucleus in each one. The gray matter in the cerebrum is found at the surface, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a later figure or diagram. The gray matter is found in the surface in the cortex. So this is the cerebral cortex. There are also deeper areas in the brain, collections of gray matter that are called nuclei. And then there's lots of white matter there all around these structures. Similarly, the cerebellum is made up of gray matter in its cortex and also in its nuclei, which are collections of cell bodies. They're fairly small in the cerebellum. So you have gray matter in the cortex and the nuclei, and also there's lots of white matter within the cerebellum, and it has a particular name. It's called the arbor vitae. I'll describe that in more detail later. The diencephalon is a region found surrounding a area that's filled with fluid called the third ventricle. Again, we'll talk about that more later. I'll give you more detail. And it has three major parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And then the fourth major part of the brain is the brain stem, and it is made up of a midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So those are the major structures, and we'll look at them in diagrams on later slides. The spinal cord, the other part of the central nervous system, is a structure that runs down the side of the spinal column. In the middle of it, there is a central cavity that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And that central cavity, that fluid-filled central cavity, is surrounded by a gray matter core. Okay, so all around it is gray matter, and then external to that is white matter, which is again made up of axons. These are in the central nervous system, collections of axons are called fiber tracts or fibers, and they happen to be myelinated. Okay, so that's the overall fundamental structure. Let's get into some more detail. Here we see a human brain, and we're looking at it from the left side. So we're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere. There's two hemispheres, a right and a left. And below that, and all of this is the cerebrum here. All this that I'm outlining is cerebrum. Okay, including across the boundaries. I'll make it darker. The boundary is here. That's the cerebrum. All of this shown here. It has many characteristic folds on its surface. These grooves and folds. And then there you have the cerebellum, which is this structure here. And then it actually goes down a little bit there. And then all of this, and I'll do it in a different color. This is the brain stem. It actually projects up. You can't see this part up into the brain. Here, that's the brain stem. And it projects a little bit further down also. So we have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brain stem in that diagram. Now, as I said, in the adult, we have four major parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and brain stem. And the cerebrum has a cortex, which is gray matter, and basal nuclei, which is gray matter, and also lots of white matter. The diencephalon has these three structures that I mentioned before. And the brainstem is made up of these, and the cerebellum, similar to the cerebrum, smaller, arranged in a different pattern, but cerebellum also has white matter and gray matter. In terms of development, what they develop from, I'm not going to get into the details of embryonic development, but the main adult brain structures, as I said, are the cerebrum, diencephalon. I'll have to do a different color here. Cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, the midbrain, the pons of the brainstem, and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, and the cerebellum and the spinal cord. And each of these different areas are derived from certain regions within the developing embryo that are listed here, but I'm not going to go through that. And this diagram here shows the structure of the central nervous system and essentially brain development at 5 weeks, and then 13 weeks, and then 26 weeks, which is roughly 6 months, and then at birth. And you can see that at birth it's very similar to an adult brain. It's not fully developed, but it is very similar to an adult brain. And the nice thing here in this diagram, let me just get rid of this. The nice thing in this diagram is that they also show the part of the brainstem that was hidden in the previous diagram, because they've made the in this diagram they've made the cerebrum translucent, so it's clear and you can see in. So in terms of the brainstem, you have the medulla oblongata, the pons, which is the enlarged area, and then above that the midbrain, and the midbrain is buried deep into the brain itself, the upper part of into the cerebrum. So I remind you, if I don't go into the details of development, embryonic development of the brain, then here, then you're not. I wouldn't hold you responsible for that, right? In terms of the spinal cord and brainstem, depending upon where you do a cross section, you'll see a different pattern. So if you do a cross section on the spinal cord, you'll see this kind of pattern. If you do it higher up through the brainstem, you'll see this kind of pattern. And then if you're in the cerebellum here, you would see this kind of pattern. One common thing is that they all have a central cavity, and it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. And this pattern here, I would want you to understand and learn, and we'll talk more about it when we cover the spinal cord. But one thing I do want to show, emphasize to you, is that there is a central cavity filled with, as I said before, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. But surrounding that is an area of gray matter, and it has a particular characteristic pattern. It has a butterfly-shaped pattern that you can see here. And then exterior to that, you have white matter. So the cell bodies that contain the nuclei are found within that gray matter and that butterfly-shaped area. All of this here, I'm not doing very well, but there. That butterfly-shaped area is all the gray matter. And that contains the neurons. And we'll talk more about that later, that structure later on. Okay, within the brain, it's not just the central cavity that you have running up your spinal cord that's a space filled with fluid, but you also have these fairly large ventricles throughout the brain, and they are also filled with CSF, and they develop during embryonic development from expansion of the space or lumen within the what's called a neural tube. The central nervous system develops initially as a tube. A tube is formed by tissue that folds over around itself, so you have an inner tube, and then the different parts expand and develop further. In the adult, the ventricles include two, and that's what paired refers to here, two paired C-shaped lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, which is inside the diencephalon, and a fourth ventricle, which is inside the brain, just dorsal to the pons. and I'll show you what I mean in the next few diagrams. So here you see a anterior view of the brain. You see all here in this part the cerebrum, and below that you see the cerebellum there, and then here in this area here you see the brain stem there. Now, as I said before, there was a central cavity or central canal in the brain stem, and the fourth ventricle, as it said on the previous slide, is dorsal to the pons. Then you have that's the fourth ventricle here, and then the third ventricle here is in the middle of the diencephalon. The tissues surrounding the third ventricle form the diencephalon, and then you have these paired C-shaped lateral ventricles, one on each side. So two C-shaped lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle, all fluid-filled spaces. When you take a lateral view, a side view, or a lateral view, then it's a little more difficult to envisage exactly where these are, but it's shown here. So yes, there are spaces in your brain, but most of it is a lot of neural tissue crammed into the skull. Now, when we look at the two sides, the left and the right hemispheres of the cerebrum, these are called the cerebral hemispheres. So it's made up of two cerebral hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere. They make up the vast majority. This is the cerebrum. It makes up the vast majority of the total brain. Here's a percentage. You don't have to memorize that percent, but that's approximately accurate percentage of the total brain mass. The surface of the brain, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of these ridges, and between them these grooves. Now a single ridge is called a gyrus, and multiple ridges are called gyri. Okay, so a single would be a gyrus. Let's see if I can write it here. Gyrus, that's one ridge, and multiple would be gyri. And then the grooves in between them are called the sulci, so a single one is called a sulcus. There are also a small number of deeper grooves, and these are called fissures, and I'll draw your attention to that later. The largest and longest actually is right down the top middle, and I'll show you later, which is called the longitudinal fissure, going from the anterior middle part of the cerebrum all the way back along the midline to the back of the brain. The cerebrum itself, as I've said before, contains gray matter cortex, or the cerebral cortex. There is also gray matter in the nuclei. These are called basal nuclei. And then lots of white matter, which is made up of axons. And that's shown in this diagram. I believe the next slide should have it in a larger, there it is. Not exactly the same, sorry. I'll go through that later, what I wanted to point out to you. Overall, the cerebrum can be divided into 5 lobes. There is a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and insula. There is the frontal lobe in this diagram shown in pink. There's the parietal lobe in blue, the occipital lobe at the back, dorsal side in green, and then the temporal lobe on the side in yellow here. The insula is buried deeper into the brain, into the cerebrum, and you can't see it here. There is running along the middle, right there, you have what is called the central sulcus. It's the sulcus or groove sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So you have that kind of structure on each side of the brain in each of the hemispheres. You have some other major landmarks that are dividing the different lobes, but I'm not going to get into their names. One thing I do want to emphasize, however, is that the ridge in front of the central sulcus, remember this is the central sulcus, I'm just going to draw it in a darker color here. This here is the central sulcus, right there. Okay? And the ridge or gyrus in front of it, anterior to it, is called the pre-central gyrus. And the ridge behind it is called the post-central gyrus. So these are what the gyri that should be gyrus, not gyri. This is these are the two gyri. Here is the spelling error. It should be gyrus. These two ridges or gyri border on either side of the central sulcus. These are important landmarks that you should understand. Okay, here we go. This is an enlargement here in the upper left side of the previous diagram, 2 slides back, I think. All right, in this diagram on the upper left side, we see the central gyrus, which forms the boundary between the temporal and parietal lobe, and just anterior to that central sulcus, we have the pre-central gyrus, and just posterior to the central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus. When you look at a wedge cut into the, if you look at a wedge here, this area here cut into the cerebrum, what you see is that the surface or outer part of the cortex is all gray matter. The outer part of the cerebrum is all gray matter, and that's the cerebral cortex. So all along the surface, and it goes down into the sulci, the grooves, you have gray matter, and that is the area which is the cerebral cortex. And below that is all white matter, except for the deeper nuclei. Here, when we look at a superior view on this side, it's a superior view. That's the anterior side, and this is the posterior side, but this is a view from on top looking down, a superior view. You see that long, deep groove, which is a longitudinal fissure, and that divides the brain into the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Okay. Okay, so if we look more carefully in terms of function in the brain, I want you to understand that, you know, the vast majority of how the brain works is not understood, but we can look at some of the function. In terms of the cortex, or the outer surface area of the cerebrum, that makes up about 40% of the brain. Remember, the entire cerebrum is about 83%, and 40% of that is cerebral cortex, and it's involved in a lot of important functions. I don't expect you um, to memorize all of these things, but you know, be aware that it's your cerebral cortex that's involved in you consciously understanding things, consciously moving, memory, and a lot's not understood about memory, but you know, your ability to communicate, your ability to sense incoming sensory information. An important aspect of the brain is that it acts in a contralateral fashion. Each hemisphere, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, act contralaterally in that they control the opposite side of the body. So your left hemisphere controls your right side and your right hemisphere controls the left side. They are not, however, completely equal in function. Some functional characteristics are more often found or are the majority of the control is in one hemisphere versus the other. In the end, however, no one functional area acts completely alone. The brain is always processing information throughout the entire cortex. So any conscious behavior will involve the entire cortex. In terms of the functional regions of the cerebral cortex, there are 3 different types of functional areas. One is the motor areas that are controlling voluntary movement. The other is sensory areas that are consciously aware of sensation. And then there are association areas which will integrate diverse incoming information. So you control your voluntary movements, so your motor areas. You are aware of sensations and are processing and aware of sensations through the sensory areas, and then association areas are integrating quite a bit of different types of information that are coming in. Let's look a little bit more at where we can localize these. If you look at the side view, the lateral view of this is the left side of the brain. Again, you have the central sulcus, and the outlined in pink here is the primary motor cortex, and it's found in the precentral gyrus. This area here in pink or red is the precentral gyrus, and that's where you have the primary motor cortex, the primary area that's involved in voluntary movement. Posterior to the central sulcus, you have the postcentral gyrus, and that's the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is the main area that's involved in perception or awareness of sensory information coming in from your body. Yes, I know there's this big area that says body awareness, but primary somatosensory cortex is a major area of sensation awareness. And then there are other areas, and you know, you will see that here at the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, that's involved in vision. I think that's important. And you have these structures here in the anterior part, just underneath the frontal lobe. These are the olfactory bulbs, and we'll talk more about them later. I tend to focus more on structures that you can see and structures that we can follow in terms of the pathways to them and the primary importance. So Muscle awareness or muscle control in the primary motor cortex, in the precentral gyrus. Sensory information processing or sensation in the primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the postcentral gyrus. Vision in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, of the cerebrum. And smell here in just underneath the frontal lobe in the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. It does localize facial recognition here in this one area, but I can tell you that there are many areas, and a large part of the brain is involved in facial recognition. It's a very important part of our awareness, that we focus in on faces. We do not recognize each other from, the size of your foot or the shape of your hand or your little finger. We focus on faces, and a large part of our brain is in fact involved in that. Okay, so let's go through this. The primary motor cortex, I've already described where it is in the precentral gyrus. Then the premotor cortex is also involved. These are motor areas. Remember, the three functional areas are the motor areas, somatosensory or sensory areas, and the association regions. So in terms of the motor areas, a major one is the primary motor cortex. In this area here, and you don't need to know this, but I'm just telling you, in this area just anterior to the primary motor cortex, you have the premotor cortex. Let's move through these slides. So the primary motor cortex is a major area of motor control. Then and it's involved in conscious control of very precise voluntary movements. And then you have the premotor cortex, and you can read this for your own information if you choose to, this information here. And then we have Broca's area and the frontal eye field. I don't expect you to, learn all of these things, but certainly I would expect you to be familiar with the idea of the primary motor cortex, where it is and what it does, because we'll talk more about it. In terms of the location of these things, they're shown here. I've underlined all four of those: primary motor area, premotor cortex, the frontal eye field, and Broca's area, but let's leave it at that, okay? Here, what's highlighted is not the lobes, different colors, but areas in terms of what they're responsible for in terms of function. And these four that are underlined are the motor areas, key motor areas. And again, this is a repeat of what you had on the previous slide, where it is, what it's involved in, which I went through. And then the premotor cortex and the Broca's area and the frontal eye field. Not unimportant areas, but I think it's enough to know about the primary motor area. Okay, so those were motor areas. And a key feature of that, of the primary motor cortex, which of course, as shown here in this diagram, is located in the precentral gyrus, shown in red. A key feature of that primary motor cortex is that the tissue is arranged in a set pattern that reflects different areas of the body. So if we're looking at the cortex in this diagram, if we look at this slice through the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus, what you have is the motor cortex. Remember that the cortex is in the outer part, and underneath that is mostly white matter. So the cortex is outlined here in red all through here, following the surface features of the cerebrum. That's the cerebral cortex. And by doing experiments on conscious people, they were able to, by stimulating, and these are done on people who are undergoing brain surgery, and a lot of this actually was done at the Montreal Neurological Institute by Wilder Penfield. So by stimulating in the pre-central gyrus, which is of course also the primary motor cortex, he was able to map out which areas control what part of the body. And those areas that are involved in very fine, or those parts of the body that are involved in much finer movement, very controlled movement and very precise movement, like the tongue, the lips, the hands, have a larger area of the primary motor cortex by which they're controlled. And so you can map this and show this kind of a map of the primary motor cortex. And this kind of caricature here, the word is caricature, it's like a comic figure or drawing showing the relative amounts of cortex devoted to each different part and in terms of motor function. That is called a homunculus. Okay, so we're looking here at this, in this diagram, at the motor homunculus, okay, which is found in the primary motor cortex of the precentral gyrus. And different parts control different parts of the body. So if you were to stimulate, for example, here in that area, then the toes would move. If you were to stimulate here in this area, then the tongue would move. That kind of thing, you see? And that's what they did, and that's how they mapped it out. The motor homunculus. Okay. Let's move on to the sensory areas. Remember, there's motor areas, there's sensory areas, and there's association areas. Sensory region, the major sensory region, is the primary somatosensory cortex, located in the postcentral gyrus. There are other areas that are very important for sensory processing and awareness of sensory information, a number of different areas, but let's stick with at least learning the primary somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory association cortex is also a sensory area, but I'm not going to get into that. Then you have also the visual area, auditory area, and Wernicke's area. The only one that I really would want you to certainly be aware of right now is vision, which is located, the visual sensory area, which is located in the occipital lobe at the posterior part of the cerebrum. And it's receiving visual information coming in from sensory tissue, sensory neurons that respond to light. So those are in the retina of the eyes. And this is the area that interprets that visual sensory stimuli in terms of color, form, and movement, etc. And we have an auditory area, we have Wernicke's area, and I'm not going to get into that. But there's information here if you're interested. So the sensory areas are underlined here, the ones I've mentioned. And the primary somatosensory cortex, of course, as I said, is in this blue gyrus, the post-central gyrus. And then you have other areas like the somatosensory association cortex, the visual cortex, primary visual cortex involved in vision is interpretation of sensory light information, sensory information coming in is here in this area in the occipital lobe. And again, this is the same information on the previous slides. Okay. Now, similar to the primary motor area in the precentral gyrus, having a motor homunculus, there is also a somatosensory homunculus. And it was found by stimulation going from this area here. This here represents, in fact, the longitudinal fissure. And then this is a map going down along the surface cortex of the cerebrum here. This area here in the post-central gyrus. So this is the somatosensory homunculus, a cartoon or caricature of the relative areas and amounts of cortical tissue found in the primary somatosensory cortex responsible for each of the different parts of the body. And there are different parts of the body that are more sensitive to touch. You know, your elbow is very, very, very insensitive. You can pinch a person's elbow as hard as you want, they won't feel a thing. But you do the same thing to their lip, and they will feel it. They will be very sensitive. So in terms of processing of sensory and genitals, but in terms of another example, but you know, in terms of the amount of different tissue is represented in the amount of cortical tissue in the primary somatosensory cortex, which represents each different parts of the body in terms of sensory, incoming sensory information. That's shown here by this diagram, the somatosensory homunculus. Okay, in addition to the motor areas and the sensory areas, somatosensory areas, in terms of functional areas of the cerebral cortex, we also have these association areas. And in one of the key areas is the prefrontal cortex, and that's located in the front of the anterior front part of the frontal lobe. And it's involved in intellect, cognition, recall, many different functions. It's what makes you able to think clearly and judge and perceive and be conscious. And is closely linked to the limbic system, which is a part of the brain that's involved in emotion. So these are association areas. They bring in information from many different other areas and process it. We have some others that I'm not going to mention. It's not the only association area, but the prefrontal cortex is an important part. And I've highlighted it here. It's in this region here, prefrontal cortex. So that's a light treatment of the major functional areas, and I focused mostly on the primary motor area, the primary somatosensory. I'll highlight them for you. I focused here in this discussion of functional areas of the cerebrum. I focused on the primary motor area, the primary somatosensory cortex, the visual cortex, the prefrontal cortex in terms of association areas. This is a motor area, this is a somatosensory area, so is this, and this is an association area. And here we have again what was written on the previous slides, just put in. Okay. So So I think, well, let's finish with the cortex before we stop this. Lateralization is an important concept, as I told you. First of all, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere control opposite sides of the body. That's contralateral control. They act in a contralateral manner. But there is also lateralization of certain abilities that some in people, you have one hemisphere having unique abilities not shared by the other. You also have, for certain things, cerebral dominance, where one hemisphere is dominant over the other for language. For example, the left hemisphere typically is more involved in language, math, and logic, and the right more in visual spatial skills, emotion, artistic skills. But you know, there is lateralization of control and some cerebral dominance for certain functions. The white matter, which is deeper in from the cortex that's at the surface in the cerebrum, the cerebral white matter has many nerve tracts and fibers made up of axons, and is responsible for communicating between the different parts of the brain and the lower parts of the central nervous system. There are three types of cerebral white matter that communicate in different directions. They are the commissures, which connect corresponding gray areas or gray matter areas from one hemisphere to the other. There are association fibers that connect parts of within the same hemisphere, and projection fibers that bring in information from the lower brain or spinal cord. So commissures are across from one hemisphere to another. Association fibers are within the same hemisphere, and projection fibers come up from below from the lower brain or spinal cord. And it's shown here. These are commissures going across here in terms of the white matter. This one actually shows the basal nuclei of the cerebrum, shown in red. These are gray matter areas that are deeper in. These are nuclei. So you have commissures going across from one hemisphere to the other. You have within the same hemisphere, and it's I don't think it's shown. You have projection fibers coming from below, from the spinal cord and lower parts of the brain up, and then you have I've forgotten what it's called. Association fibers going across. Okay, maybe in the next diagram. Yes, here in the next diagram they show association fibers within connecting different parts of a single hemisphere. This is a nice photograph of a human brain. It's a medial section right down the middle of the brain, and it gives you a clear on this side, on the right side, gives you a clear idea of the cortical gray matter of the cerebrum, and that there's lots of white matter underneath, and that deeper in you have these areas here that are, you know, nuclei, different areas that are nuclei. So that's gray matter further down in the cerebrum. And then you have this, which is the cerebellum, and it has gray matter and white matter in it. We'll get to the cerebellum soon enough. So again, I don't want to get into the details of this. You can read this for your own interest about basal nuclei, which are also gray matter found deep in the cerebrum. Okay, and this is a diagram showing one side. It's a complicated structure. Let's move on. Again, basal nuclei, showing some of the different basal nuclei in this diagram. They're shown here in pink. and blue, some of them. Okay, so we finished here with the cerebrum, and we're going to move on to the cerebellum. We're going to move on to the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So we're going to stop here. I think this is a good point to stop this recording.